Hello friends, welcome to the session. In this session, we are discussing about conservation of ecosystem. Conservation of ecosystem means to prevent the excessive use of ecosystem which leads to environmental degradation. And this is carried out through proper land use, planning for the demands of population growth and sustainability of delicate ecosystem. Indigenous conservation practices. Natural resources have to be conserved so that it can be used by the present and the future generations. This means that a sustainable yield of revenue natural resources, it has to be ensured. The continuous protection to non-renewable resources for their prolonged existence on the earth has to be ensured. Conservation of the resources was to be done in ancient times through indigenous practices which were followed from generation to generations. In day-to-day interaction with the nature, the tribal people in the olden days followed a deliberate method which used preservative of natural resources. This practice, it includes the complete exclusion of grazing pressure during certain periods along with the fodder reserves and its limited use during other periods in the term of kind and number of animals permitted for grazing. For example, in the system of Ahmias around Taif in Saudi Arabia. In a tribal society, land was considered as a living entity. It needed rest to recover its fertility. Because of this, the land was kept empty so that they could be cultivated after 2 to 3 crops. Some of the indigenous conservation practices included: first, water conservation. In water conservation, water is being harvested in India since from ancient times. Our ancestors have perfected the art of water management. Many water harvesting structures and water conserving mechanisms were followed in each and every region of our country. People harvested rainwater. From the rooftops, they collected water and stored it in tanks built in courtyards. Even from the open community lands, they collected the rainwater and stored it in artificial wells. They harvested rainwater runoff by capturing water from swollen streams during the monsoon season and by storing it in the water bodies. They harvested water from the flooded rivers. The storing mechanism of water, it is known by different names in different areas. They are called as Khatri or Kuhil in western Himalayas, Baolis or Digis in Gangetic plains, Johats in central India, Bandaras or Khere in Deccan plateau, Surangam in western Ghats, Korambo in eastern Ghats and Zing in Ladakh. Forest conservation. Trees and groves have been worshipped by the man. In ancient days, man used to revere everything around him. Since the forest provided him anna, arogya and ashra, that is food, well-being and security, he developed a relationship with them. Forest became central to all his customs and traditions. The tribals had the belief that if they destroy the forest, natural calamities were bound to occur. That is why they maintained an area within the forest as a protected or sacred one with all its flora and fauna. This sacred tract of forest also had a resident god and was known by different names in different areas. Some of the tribal communities continued this old tradition of maintaining the sacred groves. Sometimes the forests were referred to as Bhanadevi, that is the goddesses of the forest. They were also said to be Devasthan. In many tribal areas of India, there is a belief that the souls of their forefathers might live in some of the trees. Naturally, the Adivasis, that is the tribal people, they themselves were not dared to enter some areas of the forest, or they didn't even permit anyone to enter it. As a result, the biodiversity of the forest is preserved as it is. Agricultural practices. Some of the indigenous agricultural practices are mixed subsistence. In this, the traditional farmers, they characterized as managing mixed subsistence economies. That is, they employ several cropping systems simultaneously. This includes having plots under continuous cultivation, some in shifting cultivation, and also raising animals. This allowed the farmers to grow a larger diversity of outputs with a greater flexibility and increased system of stability. Intercropping. Intercropping, it involves growing different crops simultaneously within the same area of land. For example, in Java, small-scale farmers have up to 607 crop spaces in their farms, which is equivalent to the species diversity of a deciduous tropical forest. This may seem to produce unwanted competition between plants, but actually it increases yields as the plants grow at different heights and they have different roots and leaf structures. And this allows maximum utilization of abiotic inputs. This extremely efficient use of available light, nutrients and water by plants with different heights, root and leaf structure, it is one of the primary reasons why traditional systems are highly efficient. And this system, it actually increases the productivity of the land, and tropical farmers claim yield improvements as a major advantage of intercropping. For example, in northern India, the mustard plants were planted together with the wheat. In fruit orchards, leguminous crop, it is planted to increase the yield of the land. In South India, coconut trees are planted on the borders of the rice fields. Genetic diversity within crop spaces. Traditional farming, it is also characterized by a high degree of genetic diversity within each crop spaces. Farmers from different countries, they plant a wide variety of crops, and this practice, it reduces the threat of a crop loss. The diversity of a crop, it is also said to be an insurance against crop loss because it is unpredictable weather or climatic conditions. The genetic diversity within the crops, it provides a steady harvest as different varieties of crops mature at different rates, and this ensures that the harvest, it is a continuous process distributing labor demands over a longer period and providing relatively constant food supplies. Mulching and use of green manure. Traditional farmers, they often employ a system of continuous vegetative cover on the soil as either green manures or mulches. The green manures, they are generally leguminous plants grown to be plowed into the soil prior to planting crops. Alternately, the crops that can be planted concurrently with green manures with a minimum soil disturbance. Mulches, they are generally waste plant materials such as leaves, litter, branches, straw, compost, aquatic weeds, etc. Benefits of mulching and green manures include shading the soil, reduces moisture loss, reduced rainfall decreases, pathogen dispersal, wind and rain induced soil erosion is reduced, there will be a continuous addition of organic matter to the soil, leguminous green manures provides nitrogen to plants, weeds are suppressed, cover protects crop at seedling stage, soil temperatures are reduced. The Bishnois of Rajasthan. These Bishnois are a tribal people from Rajasthan, and they are considered to be as the first environmentalist in the world. This word Bishnoi, it is derived from Bish, which means 20 in Hindi, and Noi means 9. Jamboji, who is supposed to be the founder of a sect in Hindu religion called Bishnoi in 1542 AD. He gave a set of 29 tenets to his followers. Living in harmony with all creatures of nature was the basic theme of this sect. Bishnois remove living insects from firewood before burning. They never cut trees and wait for trees to die on their own or fall down during the storms. They are non-violent with a self-control, and their dead bodies are buried in the woods despite being Hindu, so as to ensure that mineralization of organic matter provides nutrition to growing trees. Bishnois believe that God is present everywhere in the nature. It is said that in Amrita Devi, a Bishnoi lady and her 3 minor daughters, they laid down their life by hugging a kedri tree during its felling by one of the king of the Jodhpur state. Altogether, 763 people were put to death for protesting against the felling of trees. By this incident, the king was deeply moved and he was lamented for his mistake. And from then on, the king ordered not to cut down the trees or hunting animals in near all villages of the Bishnois. All wildlife like chinkaras, blackbugs, etc. they move freely in Bishnoi settlements and agricultural fields. Plants and animals are the members of Bishnoi families and they are considered as their brothers, dearest children and relatives. Bishnois become extremely violent if any animal or tree is harmed in their area. An extremely aggressive race, they fight for wildlife and environment with a vengeance. Patience is a catchword. In this simple community, they have only 4 months of farming and the rest of the year they just sit around and hope the food will last. But not a stick is raised to chase away the animals. They willingly go hungry to feed the animals as they believe in the coexistence of life. The Bishnois have contributed a lot to nature and wildlife protection. Alternative conservation practices. Conservation does not mean preservation, whereas it really means utilization of natural resources in such a way that they are not destroyed completely and they can be further utilized by future generations. With the increase in population, the demand of natural resources has increased. But consequently, resources are depleting at a rate faster than their growth, which causes imbalance in the ecosystem. Therefore, the indigenous conservation practice need to adopt alternative or modern conservation measures. Modern conservation measures have 3 main objectives: to preserve biological diversity, to maintain essential ecological process and life support systems, to ensure a sustainable utilization of spaces and ecosystem. The following 2 strategies are used for conservation of biodiversity and wildlife: in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. In situ conservation, it means that conservation of wildlife in its natural habitat. It emphasizes protection of the ecosystem of the original habitats or natural environment. Objectives of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries and biosphere reserves. The basic objectives of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries and biosphere reserves are protection of natural habitats through controlled limited use of spaces, maintenance of the viable number of spaces in protected areas, establishment and protection of areas through legislation for the conservation of wildlife, educating the public for wildlife protection, conducting research in specific areas of wildlife. National Park. A national park, it is an area which is strictly reserved for the betterment of the wildlife and where human activities like forestry, grazing or cultivations are not permitted. The examples of national parks are Jim Corbett. It is the first national park of India, Sundarbans in West Bengal, Dudhwa in Uttar Pradesh and Tadoba in Maharashtra. Wildlife sanctuaries. The wildlife sanctuary, it is protected area that is particularly reserved for the conservation only for wildlife, animals and plant species. Human activities like harvesting or timber collection of minor forest products and private ownership rights are allowed. The examples of wildlife sanctuaries are Periyar in Kerala, Ranipur in Uttar Pradesh, Chilka Lake in Orissa, and Sariska in Rajasthan. Wildlife conservation projects. Several projects were carried across India to prevent the extinction of some endangered wild animal species. Some of the projects are Project Tiger. This Project Tiger, it is launched by the central government in April 1973. This is to save the tiger from extinction in India. Gir Lion Project. This project, it is being carried on the Gir forest in the Saurashtra peninsula of Gujarat region. This is to save the lions in that particular region. Crocodile Project. This project, it aims in the conservation and management of crocodiles through incubation of eggs and rearing. It is being conducted in certain sanctuaries of Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh. Project Elephant. The aim of this project, it is particular to save the number of elephants, to identify elephant reservoirs to protect them. Biosphere Reserves. A biosphere reserve, it is a special area of land or coastal environment in which multiple use of land is permitted by dividing it into certain zones. The natural or core zone, it consists of undistributed and legally protected ecosystem. The buffer zone, it surrounds the core area and it is managed to accommodate a great variety of resource use strategies. The transition zone, that is the outermost part of the biosphere reserve, is an area of active cooperation between the management and the local people. Let's have a comparison between national park, sanctuary and a biosphere reserve. This national park, it is associated with the habit of wild animal species like rhino, tiger, lion, etc. Sanctuary, it is a species oriented like picture plant, great Indian bustard, etc. Biosphere reserve, it takes into consideration the entire ecosystem. National park boundaries are marked by legislation. Sanctuaries boundaries, they are not sacrosanct, where biosphere boundaries are marked by the legislation. In national park, the disturbance is only limited to buffer zone. In sanctuary, it is limited disturbance, and in the biosphere reserve, the disturbance is limited to the buffer zone. In national park, tourism is allowed. In sanctuary, tourism is allowed. And in biosphere reserve, generally tourism is not allowed. Specific management is lacking in national park. Specific management is also lacking in the sanctuary. And in biosphere reserve, scientific management is present. No attention is paid to gene pool conservation in national park, as in the same case in sanctuary, whereas attention is paid to a gene pool conservation in case of biosphere reserve. Ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation means the conservation of wildlife outside its natural habitat. This conservation, it takes place in a captivity under man's supervision. Sometimes the population of the species, it may decline or it may become extinct. And in such cases, in situ conservation may not prove to be effective. And a species can be protected from becoming extinct only through maintaining individuals in an artificial conditions under human care. Such measures are included under ex situ conservation. Generally, botanical gardens, zoos, aquariums, parks, agricultural research centers, etc. are the artificial habitats for ex situ conservation. In order to protect a global biodiversity and encourage the study and management of endangered species, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, that is IUCN, and the World Conservation Monitoring Center, that is WCMC, it maintains a global list of endangered and vulnerable animal species. It is called as Red List. Land use planning. Land use planning, it determines how the country's urban area expands, how they affect the surrounding landscape. The main purpose of the land use planning is to avoid degradation, misuse, abusive use so as to maintain and enhance land quality. This can only be achieved through coordinated participation of all stakeholders in land resources management at all the levels such as national sectors, regions, districts and villages. Objective of land use planning in India. The National Land Use and Conservation Board, that is NLCB, at the national level, it was set up to look after the aspect concerning land use. The main objective of this board are to prevent further deterioration of land resource, it is to allocate land for different uses based on the land capability, to provide for optimum use of land, to restore the productivity of the degraded land, and to meet the consumption need for the growing population, to involve the community for adoption of appropriate land use. Zoning. Land use planning, it involves division of land units into zones. Zoning, it generally defines land units in terms of their characteristics, which are measurable factors such as slope, soil texture, rainfall, etc. and the qualities like that affects temperature, resin, moisture availability that result from a combination of characteristics. Zoning, it also matches land with potential uses and then rates the land in terms of suitability for the use. Process. Strategic land use planning is a process for determining how our land will be used. It also ensures great sustainable benefits. It involves the designing of infrastructure such as transport facilities, industrial plants, storage of produce, power generation, and facilities for towns and other human settlements. Land use planning, it is carried out in taking into account population increase and socio-economic development. That's all for the session. See you in the next session. Thank you.